I had been living in my neighborhood for almost 3 years, and over that time, my morning walks with my golden retriever, Max, had become one of the few constants in my life, a ritual that allowed both of us to start the day slowly and without stress, where the rhythm of his eager paws against the sidewalk, the occasional snuffle at a lamppost, and the gentle tug on his leash as he sniffed every patch of grass gave me a sense of calm and predictability in an otherwise unpredictable world. And while most mornings were uneventful, with joggers passing silently and neighbors nodding in acknowledgement from across the street, there was one morning in particular that would remain seared in my memory, not for anything extraordinary that Max or I did, but for the astonishing absurdity of human entitlement colliding with routine life in a suburban setting. It was a Wednesday, around 7:30 in the morning, the air crisp with the faint scent of dew clinging to the grass, and the streets nearly empty except for the occasional neighbor walking their dog or a jogger looping the block. And as I stepped onto the familiar sidewalks with Max pulling gently on his leash, I felt the usual comfort of our early morning ritual, noticing the way sunlight dappled the road through the branches of tall oaks, the sound of distant birdsong filling the quiet, and the gentle warmth beginning to creep into the air. As the day slowly awakened, giving Max plenty of opportunities to sniff every tree, hydrant, and patch of earth along our path with his usual intensity, and I indulged him because these walks were not merely for exercise, they were the small pleasures that grounded us both before the rush of work and responsibilities took over. As we rounded the corner onto Maple Drive, I noticed her standing in her driveway like a sentinel, a woman in her 40s with tightly pulled back blonde hair, oversized sunglasses, and a wide-brimmed patterned sun hat that seemed entirely unnecessary in the soft morning shade. And though she initially appeared to be simply observing, her posture was rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and her gaze fixed on Max and me with a weight that made the air feel suddenly tense, the kind of tension that announces an impending confrontation even before a word is spoken. And though I had never interacted with her before, her aura radiated a kind of self-appointed authority that left little doubt about what was coming. Max, blissfully unaware of human social codes, trotted along happily, sniffing the grass at the edges of the sidewalk, and I instinctively steered him slightly away from the edge of her perfectly manicured lawn, giving as much space as possible, assuming that common sense would prevail and the woman would allow the sidewalk to remain neutral territory. But instead, she did not move, her glare intensifying as Max's nose came within a few feet of her property, and then, without any preamble, she shouted, "Keep that dog away from my lawn." I froze for a second, both because her tone was sharp enough to startle and because I was genuinely confused, glancing at Max, who looked back at me with his head tilted in mild concern, unsure why a human would be shouting over a few inches of grass. "I'm sorry," I said politely. "I'm just on the sidewalk, and he's on a leash." Her face reddened immediately as she waved her phone in the air as though wielding it like a weapon. "I am calling the police. This dog is trespassing on my property." I blinked, certain I had misheard her. "Excuse me?" "Yes, right now. You and your dog are harassing my lawn," she shouted, leaning slightly forward as though proximity could enforce her authority. I gestured toward Max, who was now sitting politely beside me, his leash taut but obedient. "He's on a leash," I said evenly, "and he hasn't stepped onto your lawn." Her eyes narrowed, and her tone became more shrill. "I don't care. You have no right to get that close to my grass. People like you think the world revolves around them. I'm not tolerating it." By this time, a few early joggers and neighbors walking their own dogs had slowed down to observe the scene, and I felt that peculiar mix of embarrassment and disbelief that comes when a stranger turns an ordinary, law-abiding action into a public spectacle, the kind of pressure that makes you want to explain yourself even when logic says you don't need to. And I realized that arguing further was futile because her outrage was emotional, not rational, and no amount of politeness could diffuse it. She continued pacing, still on the phone, speaking loudly enough for anyone within 50 feet to hear, describing me as aggressively approaching her lawn, refusing to respect property boundaries, and potentially dangerous, all while Max sat quietly beside me, wagging his tail occasionally, completely oblivious to the way human drama had escalated over his mere proximity to a patch of green. I tried once more, calmly, to de-escalate. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but I'm not trespassing. This is a public sidewalk, and Max is on a leash. You do not need to call the police over this." Her expression hardened into what I can only describe as a mixture of fury and moral righteousness. I am within my rights to protect my property. You have no idea what's acceptable anymore. A few neighbors exchanged glances, some smirking, others shaking their heads. And one older gentleman with a small terrier finally spoke. "Lady, he's on the sidewalk, and your lawn is fine," he said calmly, as she waved dismissively at him, muttering something about other people not understanding boundaries, before returning her full attention to the phone call, launching into an even louder explanation of how she was being threatened. By this point, I had stopped walking, allowing Max to settle at my feet, and I took a deep breath, realizing there was nothing to do but wait for the police to arrive, because the woman had made it clear that she considered her discomfort more important than facts, and that a simple, peaceful morning stroll was now a battleground over imaginary violations. About 10 minutes later, a police cruiser rolled slowly down the street, engine rumbling softly, but lights off, and two officers stepped out, scanning the area before the woman ran toward them, pointing furiously at me and Max, her phone still pressed to her ear. "This is him," she shouted. "He is threatening my property. You need to make him leave immediately." The taller officer turned to me calmly. "Sir, can you tell us what's happening?" I explained everything from the beginning: the routine walk, Max's behavior, the sidewalk, her reaction, and the fact that she had called 911 over a few feet of grass. I gestured toward Max, who was now sitting obediently beside me, his golden fur gleaming in the early morning sun, looking up at me innocently. The second officer glanced at the woman, then at the lawn, then back at me. "Mom, can you point to where he actually stepped on your property?" She hesitated, clearly realizing that there was no evidence to support her claims. "Well, he was close. That counts." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Sir, as far as we can see, you are on the public sidewalk, and your dog is leashed. There is no violation here." Her face went red, then paled slightly, and she muttered, "So, you're just letting him walk?" "Yes," the officer said evenly, "because he hasn't done anything illegal." I felt a wave of relief, mixed with incredulity that an entire police visit had been triggered by a minor perceived slight. But I also noticed the subtle satisfaction of truth prevailing, because the officers calmly reiterated that emergency services should not be used for trivial disputes and reminded the woman that sidewalks are shared spaces. She finally retreated to her driveway, muttering under her breath and glaring at me once more before disappearing into her house. With her phone still clutched in her hand, I resumed the walk with Max, steering slightly further from her property to avoid any further drama, though I knew it was unnecessary, because the officers had confirmed that we had done nothing wrong. As we continued down the street, I couldn't help but notice the glances from neighbors, some chuckling quietly, others shaking their heads in disbelief at the absurdity of the situation. And I reflected on how suburban life can sometimes feel like a minefield of sensitivities, where the line between normal behavior and provoking outrage is entirely subjective and often dictated by ego rather than law. By the time we returned home, the sun was higher in the sky. Max had expended enough energy to finally settle, and I sat on my porch, reflecting on how a simple morning ritual had been transformed into an extraordinary spectacle by one person's need for control, a reminder that patience, calm reasoning, and adherence to facts are sometimes the only tools one has to navigate the bewildering overreactions of others, and that the most ridiculous disputes often reveal far more about the person creating them than the person who is their target. Max wagged his tail beside me, blissfully unaware that he had been the central figure in a suburban drama, and I realized that while mornings like these could be stressful, they also offered a strange form of validation, truth, evidence, and composure had held firm against absurdity, and sometimes that alone was victory enough in a world where entitlement often feels louder than reason.